welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I have the pleasure of sharing with you some interesting critical moments from the recently concluded Spice Spring International Invitational Grandmaster Tournament at Texas Tech University. And here is the very first position from the first round of the tournament that was played between the Hungarian international master Gergely Antal versus the young and very talented, only 13 years old, Darwin Yang from Plano, Texas. In this position, as you can see, White has a beautiful pawn on f6, which can be a very important aid to the White queen, and if that queen would get to h6, obviously, Black could resign right away with an undefendable checkmate. In this position, it was White's turn, and it is the critical moment of the game. The difficulty is in the situation that if White just makes a most natural move such as Queen h4, after Queen captures the pawn on b2 simply, Queen h6 does not quite accomplish the goal because the Black queen would grab that very valuable and important pawn. So let's go back to this position, and I suggest that before you listen further into the lesson, you try to figure out on your own what is the correct continuation. I have to tell you that White, even though he's a very strong player rated over 2500 FIDE, missed the opportunity because it seems that this wins and that wins and everything wins, and sometimes when you seem to have a lot of good choices, you get careless and you actually may miss the opportunity. Well, coming back to the game, White chose to play rook f to c1, which you may wonder, what does that have to do with the attack? Well, let's go back again to this position and investigate the various natural choices that White has. The idea that White was spending a lot of time on and trying to make it work was to play Queen to f4 with obviously the same idea, Queen h6, and now if the Black king would try to move, then indeed the queen would appear on h6, rook g8, and then White could simply bring the rook to aid the queen, to aid the attack, bring it back to c3, threatening to either play rook h3 right away, or even do the fancy way and sacrifice the queen on h7 first and checkmate after that. If Black right now would play rook to b3, preventing the rook h3 move, whether immediately or after the queen sacrifice, then on the other hand, White would use the other typical method to win in similar situations, and that is to deflect Black's rook from g8, from where it protects the key g7 square. And bringing the rook back to b8 wouldn't be helping at all, because Queen g7 would arrive with a checkmate. We're back again to the starting position of our analysis. So Queen f4, as I said, is a very natural move, and it's the move that White spent quite significant time on trying to make work. Of course, just as I mentioned, the scenario if White would have tried Queen h4, the key question is what would happen after Queen b2 with the idea to put pressure on the pawn on f6, and then if Queen h6, then Queen takes pawn. And the move that White thought wins at first was rook c2, a brilliant looking move, and it seems that now the Black queen must leave that diagonal from where its pressure is the f6 pawn, and whether the queen moves elsewhere or captures the rook, then White achieves the goal and Black cannot avoid the checkmate. The problem was that White discovered that Black is able to save the game with a counterattack, namely by playing rook to b4, counterattacking. If queen h6 now, the pawn on f6 falls, and if the queen moves, for example, to a square like g5, then black would be able to remain on this key diagonal on d4, and in fact, the next move black is likely to play queen to f4, forcing the exchange of the queens. And of course, once the queens would be off the board, black's 2 extra pawns would be a very significant and most likely decisive advantage. So let's go back again, and now we know that queen f4 does not quite cut it because of queen b2, and then after rook c2, the brilliant rook b4 saves the day for black. Well, we still don't know what the correct sequence is. Well, we tried various queen's moves already, and now here comes the correct one. Queen to e3. Again, the idea is the same. Black captures the pawn, attacking the f6 pawn, and now white has the opportunity to simply cut off black's queen from that diagonal. And then black is pretty helpless against the queen appearing on h6. For example, if king h8, queen h6, and the most beautiful and energetic way, white ends the game. Very nice. The only other thing that black can try after queen e3, queen b2, rook c3 is to try to give up the queen, but obviously this results a rather hopeless endgame, mostly because the white queen can still come back and create an attack and, for the least, put black in a very passive position, defensive position after king h8 and rook g8, and then white will have the time to bring the rook into the attack through the c-file and the 7th rank, and black would not survive for very much longer. Sadly for white, he did not see the idea of queen e3 followed by rook c3, and instead followed by playing rook f to c1. Black now captured the pawn on b2, came queen f4, without any immediate threat, as if queen h6, then queen f6 would come. Of course, the only other potential threat would be to still retreat the rook to c3, but the rook on c1 wasn't really needed to go there. Black now played h6, trying to get rid of this idea of white's of playing queen h6. And now the rook indeed came back to c3. And black played g5, rook g3, and king h7. White sacrificed. If now takes, threatening to checkmate, black will end up needing to sacrifice the queen for the rook on c1. That's why black rather played a better move here, rook g8. Rook captured on g8, rook captured back, and we can tell that white's attack is pretty much over. The black king is relatively safe, and black maintained an extra pawn. Let's move on now to a later stage of this very game that resulted a second very interesting and somewhat unusual situation. So much later into the game, this is after white's 43rd move, black is up 2 pawns. While by no means it's an easy win for black because the pawns are isolated, and more experienced players, I bet, have heard before of the difficulties of winning in rook endgames when you have a bishop and a rook pawn. Very oftentimes, especially if the weaker side's king is able to be in front of those pawns, unlike right now when the white king is on e5. But like imagine the white king being somewhere on the g-file or f-file or h-file, somewhere around there. And if that's all white would have, the king, the rook, and black having also king and rook versus an f and an h pawn, most of those positions are theoretically drawn, which means that if white plays accurately and correctly, black cannot win that endgame despite their 2 extra pawns. Well, our situation in the game is somewhat different because white still has a pawn on h3 and so does black on a5. However, that may mean that if those 2 pawns get off the board, theoretically the game is a draw. In this position, black responded by protecting the pawn from a2, which is certainly a natural looking move. In view of what happened in the game, I may prefer to rather protect the pawn from the side, from g5. The game continued with rook a2, and now white is kind of on a waiting process, a4 and king g4, a3, and king h5. You'll see very soon what is white's idea. Rook a1, and now white could not capture the pawn on h6 because then rook h1 would attack the pawn on h3, and if king protects, then of course the pawn simply advances, or even the rook was hanging, of course. And if the rook moves trying to catch the pawn, then the a and f pawn is quite an easy win in the rook endgame. So let's go back. White did not fall for this relatively simple trick, but pushed the pawn to h4. And black advanced the pawn to a2. Now the white king cannot move, because if it would move to g4, the black rook would get out of the corner with a check, and then the pawn could get promoted. White made a simple waiting move with rook a3. And here black made a painful mistake. Honestly, I'm not quite sure if black still has the opportunity to win the game, because, for example, after king f6, white would capture the pawn, and then simply start advancing the h-pawn, f5, rook a5, king e4, and just keep chucking the king. And it's not easy to see how black can make progress. And white will also just keep advancing his own pawn. Going back just a bit into this position after rook a3, black played f5, thinking that he'll simply advance the pawn, and now, for example, if rook makes a move, then f4, king g4, still a check, and basically after rook a3, just advance the pawn. If rook takes the pawn, the white rook then no longer would be behind black's fast pawn on a2, and then the rook can just get out of the corner and promote the pawn. Here, black had to face a very unpleasant surprise that works because the white king is in a stalemate position. All of a sudden, the rook can capture the pawn on a2. As if rook takes rook, it's stalemate. Moreover, anywhere the black rook would try to move away, it could be simply chased until 3-move repetition occurs. What an amazing game, isn't it? Let's move on to another interesting game. This position has been reached between the Hungarian international master Gábor Pop against the well-liked American grandmaster Ben Feingold. White played a beautiful game so far and has a big advantage, a strong attack, even though black is the one who just won a pawn on e5. We can see that all the white pieces are aiming towards black king, and white is ready for action. Well, it's not very hard to see what the first move should be. However, it's a bit more hidden, the follow-up on how to end the game. Again, I suggest you take your time and try to figure out it on your own before you go further and listen to the solution. And the game continued with the correct bishop takes g6, destroying all the defensive pawns in black's king side. Pawn took, and white simply traded bishops. Rook captured back, and this was actually the critical moment that white did not have too much time on the clock and missed the winning opportunity. Another situation when it seems like everything wins, but it's rarely the case. Precision is usually required. White has here two attractive moves, one of them being queen f6, and the other one, the even more natural, rook takes pawn. In this case, the natural move was the better one, and it would result in checkmate in just a few moves. After king h7, white can sacrifice the rook. If, by the way, now rook h5, amazingly, white can checkmate in just two moves. Very brilliantly, rook f7, and now all the white pieces are hanging. After king g6, queen f6, or if queen takes f7, queen h5 checkmate. And of course, if the king goes to the corner, then queen f6. Let's go back one move and see what happens after king does take the rook right away. Then, of course, rook f6, king g7, queen h6, king g8, rook check, king f7, rook g7, and followed by queen h8. A beautiful checkmate missed by white. Let's go back a couple more moves. White chose to play queen f6, which I have to admit looks quite attractive as well, although it lets black's g-pawn remain alive. Black now played very well, defended very well, and came back to life. Checked with queen c5, king h1, and g5. Queen g6, king h8, and now white's problem is that their back rank is also unprotected. White tried real hard, but eventually the game ended in a draw in many more moves on move 67. Let me show you one more game that was played at the Spice Spring Invitational just a few days ago. In this position, white is 3 pawns up, and this game is played between the Canadian young, very talented junior player and the 13-year-old Darwin Young. This was another very narrow escape by the young talent from Plano, Texas. It seems that it's only a question of how and when white will win, not if white will win. It's hard to believe that white succeeded to lose this game within the next 10 moves, without blundering a rook, without stepping into a one-move checkmate. It's pretty sad for white and a very rare turnaround, I guess, from such a difficult position. White played rook a7, which was still reasonable, and black played rook c2. Now black has a sneaky plan, namely to double the two rooks on the second rank and then move their king away, and all of a sudden, with the help of the bishop, black may target the g2 pawn 3 times, and if black would succeed to win that pawn, there would be some decent chances to draw the game thanks to the fact that there are opposite colored bishops on the board. Here the simplest way to win for white was the very natural h4, simply advancing the pawn, and then after rook d2, continue advancing the pawn, rook c2, just advance the pawn, and after king f5, which finally attacks the pawn, then just give a check. And at that point, either the king needs to go back to e4, when it would cover up the bishop's target to g2, or if it would move to g6, white has a number of ways to win. For example, simply playing f5, check, sacrificing the rook, and then capturing black's rook, h7, and white's pawn is unstoppable. White did not play h3, h4 right away, but retreated the rook to a3. This certainly missed a good opportunity, but of course white still is much better. Black played a very correct rook e2, preventing on one hand the check on e3 and also preparing the entrance of the second rook to the second rank. White tried to trade rooks, but naturally black is no game and moved the rook simply away to the b file. And now came h4, and black achieved his dream in getting the second rook also to the second rank to attack the g2 pawn. White advanced further, and now king f5. Well, the big difference compared to the previous variation is that white wasted a whole bunch of rook moves instead of advancing the h-pawn further. Now white has no choice but to lose the g2 pawn. And believe it or not, at this stage it is white who needs to worry about not losing the game. For example, if the pawn advances, then simply check, followed by checkmate in the corner. After bishop g2, white played the only move, pretty much, protecting the e1 square, rook c1, and now bishop d5. And even though white is up 2 pawns in this position, black is extremely active and the white king is in a lot of trouble. And actually, black threatens with rook h2, rook h1, which is quite difficult to prevent. Perhaps white's best choice was to try to activate his bishop with bishop e7, giving up on the pawn on f4, and then after rook h2, play rook g5 check. But nevertheless, black's position is clearly better already at this stage. White played king f1 in hopes that then after rook h2 and rook h1, the rook can perhaps block with rook g1. Even though rook h2 led to a win in this position as well, black's move was correct as well with rook f2 check. Now if king g1, then rook h2. And if now king f1, with the idea to follow rook h1 check with rook g1, then amazingly, black would just play bishop c4 check. And if rook takes, the other rook on b1 gives the checkmate. The game continued with king e1 and not king g1. And now black has 2 ways to win. One, the elegant bishop c4, which threatens with rook f1 checkmate, and then after rook takes, rook h2, and black is winning because white is helpless against the dual checkmate threats with both rooks. But of course, black's simple choice did the job just as well by playing rook h2 first, and after rook g1, rook b to e2 check, and if king goes to f1, rook h2 f2 checkmate, or after king d1, bishop b3, white loses a rook and the game. Quite an amazing comeback for black, and very resourceful, and of course a very disappointing loss for white from such a winning endgame. What's the moral of the story? It is that a game is never over until it's over. No matter how winning your position seems, you always need to look out for the opponent's traps and tricks, because believe me, your opponent is there to cause you harm, not to assist you in losing a nice game to you. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week, which was composed by one of my favorite composers, Rink. In this position, it seems that as long as the white pawn does not get promoted, the game is a draw. and black threatens to go behind that pawn and, if nothing else, give up the rook for the pawn, and game over, draw. But white has a tricky move to close up the c-file, give a check, and then advance the pawn. Now the rook seemingly cannot catch that pawn. The e1 square is guarded by the knight. The c-file is locked up with the knight, and the b8 square is covered by the pawn. It's at least so it seems. But black can play rook b8 anyway. And now, if pawn takes rook and queen, that's stalemate. Wow, what a surprise. Same happens if pawn takes rook and the pawn promotes to a rook. The only way to win is to take and promote to a bishop. I'm not saying it's a simple win, but hopefully you can do it. And definitely it's an objective win. Takes a bit, about 22 moves I believe from this position, but it's doable. A beautiful endgame. I hope you enjoyed these interesting critical moments from the Spice Spring Invitational and of course our Jewel of the Week. And be back next week for some more chess goodies. Take care. So long until next week.